Hello and welcome to the Vidhi book Adda. This is the fourth edition of the Vidhi book Adda that we are hosting today. And today we are going to be discussing Shrayana Bhattacharya's book, Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh Khan. I hope you can see the copy of this book. And we have with us Shrayana Bhattacharya, who is the author of the book. She's also an economist at the World Bank. And discussing this book along with Shrayana, we have Dr Anisha Sharma, who is an associate professor at assistant professor at the Ashoka University, and Deepika Kinhal, who is senior resident fellow and team lead at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, who oversees judicial reforms. Now, this book, by its title, you might think, why is it part of the Vidhi book Adda? It generally talks legal titles, which talks about things like negotiation, competition law, corporate law, and so on. But this book actually is a fascinating examination of a very interesting set of phenomena which has taken place in India in the last 30 years. And it's not just the success of Mr. Khan. It is also the social, political, and economic changes that we see going on around us. And this book is an attempt to try and make sense of what we're doing. At a recent podcast, I think Amit Varma of Seen and the Unseen said this, and I can only reflect his words. This is not just a work. This is not just a work of an economist. It is a work that brings together anthropology, sociology, an interesting narratives to tell a rich and complicated story about post-liberalization India, and specifically the lives of India's women post 1991. And the reason why I pick post 1991 is also something that Shrayana points out in her book, which is that Shah Rukh Khan as a megastar, as a film star, his career seems to be inextricably tied with the changes which took place in India following the reforms undertaken under the P.V. Narasimha Rao government, which is famously associated with Dr. Manmohan Singh. And we have, I think, almost all the audience who are attending this are those who have lived the vast majority of their lives, in this period. Most of us have seen the changes happen before our eyes. And just before we began, I mentioned that there is this fantastic show on the Disney Hotstar called Dil Bekarar, featuring Anuja Chauhan's, based on Anuja Chauhan's Those Pricey Thakur Girls, set in the late 80s. And I was telling our panelists that it feels like a different world. It may just be 3 or 4 years away from, the post-liberalization era, but it still feels like a very different world. So, which is where I sort of wanted to start off this discussion. And let me start off by asking Shrayana a couple of very specific points that I've had in mind when I've read this book. So Shrayana, just to kickstart this discussion, I think the first thing that sort of comes up when you see the title or reads the book is what made you want to tell these stories, specifically in terms of you bring together not just data about this is how women's lives in a post-liberalization India have changed, not changed, and so on. But you also go in depth into the lives of several women cutting across socioeconomic strata. So I just sort of wondered if you could start this discussion on why this particular methodology, if you want to call it, or by this particular framework for this book.
Well, firstly, Alok, let me just thank you for inviting me and Vidhi for hosting the book as part of the book Adda. I recognize that it's a different book from usually the books that are on, and I'll get into that in a second. And it's such a pleasure to be here with Anisha and Deepika and everyone else who's joining us. And I hope everyone's safe and well. We're all still going through a relentless, difficult time with COVID. So I just wish everybody who's joining us well. Alok, I wish I could tell you I had some grand framework when it came to the book. And in fact, to me, the book is a product of what will happen if you follow instincts and accidents, because the book did very much start as a sheer set of accidents, which is in 2006, I was a research assistant for a feminist think tank. The think tank was called Institute of Social Studies Trust. I was sent to the slums of Ahmedabad to do a very simple survey. I was a research assistant. I think all of us on this panel probably have had jobs like the one I'm describing right now, where you're sort of supporting projects and you're asked to go collect data. And I was very young. I was in my early 20s and quite foolish. And I was sent to collect information on women who were making agarbattis at home, incense sticks. And these were usually piece rate workers. They were earning, per 1,000 incense sticks that they would roll, they would earn a certain amount of money. And this project was with the Self-Employed Women's Association. And the idea was to shed light on this very invisible workforce, which is actually quite significant. 64% of women in manufacturing work from home. Get a sense of their wages, working conditions. And when I went to collect the data, all these women just looked tremendously bored because they were contending with their own economic realities. This was, these questions, I've said this before, they've seen people like me multiple times with their questionnaires. And so we decided, in classic research, they teach you take a break, icebreakers, talk about something else. And we started talking about popular film. And I'm a mad Shah Rukh Khan fan. And everywhere I went, Alok, right from the slums of Ahmedabad to the villages of Jharkhand and Uttar Pradesh, I met women who were working in very precarious circumstances, but also happened to be Shah Rukh fans as well. And it interested me that we all found something similar actually in the way we would see the actor. And yet obviously our class positions, our caste positions, the way we occupied socioeconomic space in India was so different. And then I started following up on these stories. I followed up each time Mr. Khan had a release. I won't say there was a particular method to it. It was very much just following up on people's lives. And those conversations lasted for more than a decade in some cases. And in some cases, I was selective when I wanted to open up the book to also include women of my own class. I essentially did, almost a survey of about 100 women who were just fan women, and I wanted to know how they were interacting with Mr. Khan, his films, their own economic circumstances. And when I started to look at all the notes, Alok, what really surprised me was I realized fandom became a very interesting way, and as you called it, a framework to actually talk about how women were occupying socioeconomic space. Because fandom, we think of it as just some kind of personal preference, but it is an economic activity. To actually follow Mr. Khan, you need money, you need access to free time, you need access to markets, technology, and all of these things were actually attributes that women were struggling to find. And I think as I started to follow up and I realized that through fandom, they were telling us a very interesting story and a very intimate story actually about how the economy felt to them. And I think the word felt was really the emphasis for me, the intimacy that the economy holds. And I realized it was purely because we were talking about Mr. Khan, that the intimacy really came alive, beyond the numbers. And I also happen to be someone, thanks to my training in economics, thanks to my job, I was extremely well versed with the data and the literature on women in the workforce. And I think as I was collecting these notes and I was also consuming the academic information, it all just came alive. And I decided then that I wanted to tell a story of how women have occupied this socioeconomic place of India for the past 30 years, because the stories, in a way, although I met these women in 2006, because we were talking about Mr. Khan, many of them had seen him from the 1990s. It ended up becoming a story of how these women have lived their lives from liberalization into lockdown. Many of them were born in the 1980s. They're of our generation, I suspect. And it just became a fascinating way for the numbers to come alive. And the other thing that I realized, Alok, when I sat back to look at the notes and listen to the conversations, is that again, because of Mr. Khan's persona as this romantic superhero, right, of India, and in fact of South Asia, I would contend the world. Not only were these women talking about the way they were accessing money, markets, media, and free time, they were also talking about men. What frustrated them about men, what were the scripts of masculinity that were making it so difficult for them not only to do well in their economic spaces, but also personal spaces, their own welfare, and feeling meaningful and feeling loved. And it was complete accident. I wish now, of course, by the time you end the book, you can stitch it up in a kind of framework. But I never thought that these conversations with Mr. Khan about Mr. Khan, I wish I had conversations with Mr. Khan. I have not had conversations with him, but I've had conversations with women about him. They just opened up this really electric space for a very long period of time to talk about men, money, markets, the movies, obviously. And I realized the only way to tell this story was not an academic text, but was actually in fact, taking a hat tip from Mr. Khan's own persona, a slightly light in touch, somewhat self-deprecating, somewhat funny way of telling this story, but telling the story such that you would do justice, or I would try and do justice to the feelings that were shared with me, because many of us actually did become friends in as much as we could. And if I were to tell a story of people who were close to me and had shared so much of their lives, I would want to do it in a sincere way. And the book, what I will end by saying is, Alok, when I stepped back and I looked at the notes and I was trying to pull all of that together, what was very clear to me was, the book starts, for anyone who hasn't seen the book, the first page of the book is actually a graph of female labor force participation. Yes, thank you. And it's a graph and it's overlaid with Mr. Khan's films. And to me, the book is the story of that graph. What has that graph felt like? Not from the perspective of an academic or a perspective of an activist. I'm not trying to argue for something. I'm not trying to make a thesis. I have no solutions, honestly, in the book to offer. But I think the place for activism comes from affect, from feeling. And if we feel strongly enough about something, if we can sit with the way other people have felt in their lives, perhaps that can be a cause and call to arms and action. And I really wanted, if I was tricking people into reading about how women have occupied public space and the economy through Mr. Khan, great. Although I don't think I have. I think Mr. Khan is very upfront and center in the book. But to me, it was important that when the reader put that book away, that graph would come alive to them. And I think in Mr. Khan, I just found just an accidental, wonderful conduit to do that. I would have never actually approached it that way. It just happened. Alok, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. I muted myself. What I was just about to say, thanks, Shrayana. And I think that provides the right jumping off point to something that I'd want Anisha to weigh in on. And this graph, I was just going to refer to it, and Shrayana, you've done that. This particular graph, which sort of shows the fall in female labor participation in the economy. This is something that I think, at least since I started reading about it in the last few years, the debate has undergone, I mean, there is a lot more information now. There's a lot more nuance in it and a lot of different perspectives on it. But one thing perhaps strikes me, and one thing that is also mentioned in the book, is India seems a little bit like an outlier on this when compared to countries approximately equal. So I just maybe, Anisha, if you could just sort of talk a little bit about some of the basic concepts of this, because not a lot of our audience are necessarily economists who have a clear definition of this term, and also how much of an outlier is India, given the levels of female labor participation that we see.
Thanks, Alok. Thanks for inviting me. Great to be here and discuss Shrayana. It's a really great book. Congratulations, Shrayana. Yeah, I mean, I think India is considered an outlier in this regard in a couple of ways in terms of female labor force participation. So in terms of what we're measuring, this is the share of women above the age of 15 or between the age of 15 and 60 who are actively looking for work or who are actively employed in some kind of economic activity. And in India, that percentage, depending on how you measure it, it can vary quite a bit, but between urban and rural areas, it's 20 to 30%, right? In a place like Delhi, it's even lower. And this is a really low number, speaking on a comparatively global basis. The only countries that are really lower than this are Middle East and North African countries, which where you'd argue there are strong social norms against the participation of women in economic spaces or outside of their homes at all. And so in one way in which you might consider India an outlier is that given the level of per capita income that we have here, if we believe that female labor force participation should track economic development, at least somewhat, the level of female labor force participation here is much lower than our income levels would otherwise predict. There's a relationship that several economists believe is represented in economic development, which is that at initial stages of development, where countries are poor, largely agrarian, rural, you have really high levels of female labor force participation. As the economy develops, more and more women withdraw from the labor force because they don't have the kind of jobs that they would like to work in. And so labor force participation falls. And then finally, there's a kind of a turning point after which the economy modernizes, rapidly industrializes, or there's a growth of the service sector, and you have more and more women re-entering the labor force and female labor force participation rising again. So even assuming that India is kind of sitting at the bottom of that U shape, we're still a lot further off any of our economic peers in terms of income levels. All other countries in Asia, for example, at least twice as high, if not more, level of labor force participation than in India. So that's one reason in which for which India is considered a little bit of an outlier. The second reason is kind of closely related to the graph you guys are talking about, which is that in the last 15 or 20 years, we've had this trend, which many people consider very peculiar, of rising female education, falling fertility. So women are having fewer children than they were previously, and simultaneously dropping out of the labor force market. So labor force participation should increase if education goes up, or should increase if fertility goes down. But we don't see that in this case, right? And some people have argued that that's a bit strange. I'd say that pattern isn't quite as unusual. We do see that in other countries in East Asia as well. For example, we have seen in the last 20, 30 years, we have seen declines in female labor force participation along with declines in fertility. But they're coming off just such a high base. We're talking about declines in China, like 75% comes down to 60% or whatever. And here we are, stuck at 20, 25% labor force participation. So just in terms of absolute levels, we are way off in terms of our economic peers.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, Anisha, and I think this is also helpful because, and I asked this question as a layperson, we are not saying that this is just a problem that there are just no jobs in India. It's not just say a function of the fact that there are no jobs in India. This is something that women particularly and peculiarly seem to face when they try to enter the labor market. Is that the right way to understand this?
That's an interesting question. I don't think it's easy to separate those two issues out from one another entirely. I think it is very much linked to the fact that that there are not enough jobs that women would be willing to take up, or the right kinds of jobs that they would be willing to take up. But having said that, there's also this kind of supply side issue that many women would simply just not have the space to be able to work. And we can say that, well, South Asia is very patriarchal. We have families dominated by a joint family setup. Women stay at home. They have a lot of housework and care work to do, and so on and so forth. Women aren't encouraged to step out of the house and go into unsafe outside spaces, all the rest of it. And those norms are important. But actually, research has shown that in terms of progressive gender norms, if we look at other countries at a similar level as us, even there, labor force participation significantly lags in India compared to some of those other countries. So, for example, India's gender norms are probably not quite as bad as those of Middle East and North Africa, but yet there we have it. Those are our peers in terms of labor force participation. Yeah. So I think a part of the story is also that there simply haven't been enough jobs of the kind that would have tempted women out of the home. And East Asia is instructive in this regard, right? It's not exactly a paragon of gender equality there either, and certainly wasn't a few decades earlier. But at the same time, you've seen really fantastic transformations that have taken place in many East Asian countries, which have pushed women out of the home and into the workforce. We just haven't seen that here.
Alok, can I just come in on this?
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of things. One, what I think is really different when you look at the Indian labor landscape compared to even East Asia, or in fact, Latin America, certainly some of our own peers, is caste. And what I mean by that is, if you look at one of the really enduring, and I get into this in the book because the book has all these summaries and explanations of different theories of what's going on. And of course, I think Anisha will share my frustration in this, which is because our country is so large and there's such heterogeneity, it's difficult to say this is why, we are seeing this difference. There are all these different reasons going on in different regions based on agroclimatics, based on demography, development. So it's difficult to have a pan-India answer, but I think in the book, I try and give you different buckets of answers that economists and sociologists and anthropologists are trying to contend with. But I think caste is really the one that I want to highlight, because what's happening is, and this keeps coming up in the stories in the book, you would have noticed, is that families are so afraid of what women will do with their bodies if they move out of the home and meet men, meet strangers, move outside their sort of predetermined caste puritanical networks. There was the Pew survey that was done in the middle of the pandemic. And Indians, when they were asked, are you comfortable with your daughter marrying outside the caste community? Everybody, majority just said no. It's something that really, the tyranny of marriage and the association of marriage with caste purity, right? Like that, I do think is very different if you compare India to certainly our other lower middle income peers, to countries that would even currently host some of similar attributes as us in terms of heterogeneity, economic development, demography, and so on. So I do want to sort of highlight caste, which is also why you see, according to the CMIE data, in the richest 20% in India, amongst married women, only 6.5% hold a job, and most of these are upper caste women. And there is a sense that as the country grows, and it has grown largely for the upper caste, much more so than other communities, there's a sense that these very puritanical ideas of withdrawing women back into the home to uphold honor is very important. And you see this time and time again, this constant policing of women's bodies, women's relationships, even the fact that they like Shah Rukh as an actor, I mean, even as an idea, right, makes so many people so uncomfortable. Female sexuality in general makes everyone uncomfortable. And I do think we have to recognize that this, there are scholars like Nivedita Menon who've really, I think, written a lot about this, which is that this complete tying together of caste honor with actually women's mobility. And so it's not really surprising that that is also playing itself out. It's a sociological phenomena. It's playing itself out in the labor market. So that's one. Right. And the other thing I just want to highlight, I think, compared to, say, particularly in East Asia and again, Latin America, is most Indian women are working from home. Even with growth, what you saw was the kinds of jobs post-liberalization that really boomed for women. The way the transformation of the structures of the economy were working. A lot of this manufacturing, as I mentioned, majority of it is still home-based. These are jobs that were not recognized. They've now become depressed post-demonetization. Those sectors are shrinking. And I think just to echo what Anisha was also saying, that there's work that shows that as the economy has transformed, the jobs that typically, even in these sort of smaller, small-scale handloom sectors, cottage industries, different kinds of home-based industries, wage work within the home, that's also shrunk for women. It's moved. And so I think we're seeing that play out. Let me stop there. Back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Shrayan. I think that's a very important point, because I just sort of wanted to make what we have spoken about. We're spoken about the economy in general. We've mentioned a specific set of sectors. And I want to sort of, for our audience, try and, narrow down our focus a little bit to one sector, which we know very well, which we have, Vidhi had done the research, and sort of add this little dimension to it. Because what we see, and I'm speaking even from the day when I was in law school, about 50% of the graduates were women. But when you actually go into the courts, in the physical spaces of our courts, whether you're looking at the judges or whether you are looking at your peers, you find that the representation of women is much lower. But something interesting is also going on, because we are seeing that it's not as if the women are totally disappearing from the workforce on this front, but they are in fact, turning up in a different part of the legal sector, which is law firms, which is tiny compared to, say, the practice part of things. It's tiny, but we are seeing a much larger concentration of women. And Deepika, maybe if you could speak a little bit about our research in terms of what we see in terms of how women are represented, what are the kinds of barriers they face when it comes to practice, taking off a little bit from what Anisha and Shrayana have spoken about.
Sure. First things, so glad to be here. And Shrayana, congratulations on this wonderful book. This is the first book I read this new year, and I didn't know I could speed read at this pace. So thank you for putting together sort of a non-boring way of talking about gender, economics, politics, patriarchy, and everything in between. It's a rare compilation series. So thank you for that. Now coming to Alok's question, or rather a set of facts that he mentioned and giving some numbers to that. At Vidhi, as part of the judicial reforms work, we have focused on diversity within the judiciary. I will start from there and then perhaps go to legal profession. And legal profession in itself is quite diverse. There is no one single way of looking at it or defining legal profession itself. But starting at the top, and if we can consider judiciary to be that, within the judiciary, we know we have like a tiered system. We have the Supreme Court, then High Court considered to be the higher judiciary, then we have the subordinate judiciary. Usually the higher judiciary takes up a lot of limelight, which is why perhaps everyone here might be familiar with the kind of gender disparity we see on the bench in the higher judiciary. Recently, it made news because 3 female judges got elevated to the Supreme Court, and it was a cause of celebration throughout the country. But ironically, the current numbers that we have, which is 4 female judges amongst 32 sitting judges in the Supreme Court, is the highest ever representation women have ever had in the Supreme Court, and that is around 12%. And higher judiciary overall, which is the Supreme Court and the High Court, it comes down to around 11%. Then if we go to district judiciary, and this is where things get interesting, we see that the representation is 27%. As your book, Shrayana, illustrates, the same thing gets replicated in the judiciary as well, which is that you go higher up the ladder, the representation dips remarkably. Multiple reasons for that, and the most obvious one, which is there in almost all sectors, is that it's not just about breaking the glass ceiling, right? It is also about surviving in the profession long enough to reach that glass ceiling. That simply doesn't happen in a system which continues to be conservative, which continues to be closed, male dominated in several parts. So systemically, it is designed in a way that women participation is as minimal as possible. We have a few bits and pieces of news where we celebrate that this particular judge got elevated to the High Court or the Supreme Court or is now part of the collegium, but it is extremely minimal. I don't think we can say that the system itself is changing because of these examples. Now, why is it that the judiciary is composed the way it is? Why is gender disparity as stark? It is because of the way the bar is structured, right? Because one of the pool of candidates for the judiciary are the advocates. And here, as Alok was mentioning, legal profession, if we look at the bar, which is advocates practicing in the court, very minimal representation of women. Unfortunately, we don't even have data to identify how many female advocates currently practice in the country. There is some rough guesstimate that it is around 10% of the entire bar. And even here, you will see that the maximum representation will be in the younger age bracket. As soon as students graduate, they perhaps consider litigation as one of their career choices and start practicing. But when it comes to women sustaining in the profession long term, there are multiple barriers. And this is classically seen in how there is this interplay between the bar and the bench in the subordinate judiciary. We sort of looked at what is happening specifically at the district court level. Even within the district court, there are multiple tiers. It starts with like civil judge junior division, then to senior division, then to district judge, which is the highest cadre within the subordinate judiciary. And here we see that the entry level, the representation of women is quite high. It is around 40 to 50% in quite a few states. But as you go higher up the ladder, for even the district judge level, the percentage dips to an extent that several states have 0 district judges, female district judges. Why is that the case? We looked at how the examinations are conducted, what is the qualification requirements. We see that for the district judges, there is a requirement of 7 years continuous practice to be eligible. And the minimum age requirement is 35. Now, put both of these together, you see why there is a systemic barrier for women to even contend for that position, right? So most of the female advocates don't even qualify to become district judges. And then continuing in the profession itself, as I mentioned, it is male dominated, and even interaction, and I speak on this through personal experience. I practiced in Karnataka. As a young female lawyer, it was extremely difficult to cross those gender barriers day in, day out. It was a struggle on a daily basis to prove your worth, to show them that, you know, you can be as competent and as hardworking as your male counterparts. You have to put in extra effort. You have to have higher, emotional bandwidth to take everything that is thrown at you. And more importantly, you need to have that structural support, both from the family and at your workplace. And for all these factors to come together for a woman to thrive, obviously it is a rare occurrence. Here again, one of the things that you mention in the book, Shrayana, about how family support is so important, right? And how the connections, the kind of networks that a person has, that plays such a critical role for a woman to thrive in any profession for that matter. And here that is extreme, that plays a very significant role, both for male and female lawyers. But female lawyers, given the kind of disadvantages that they are already dealing with, family connections and networks become all the more important. So without family background, without having a legal background to sustain in the profession, for a first generation female lawyer, as in I'm yet to hear of a success story there for my generation of female lawyers. Most of them just give up, as in I gave up because, you know, pregnancy came in between, and then I was like, can I put in as many hours, and is it going to be worth it? Will my work be recognized? So I took a step back. So speaking personally, I know how it affects. Just one last point on how there is a distinction within the legal profession, and how this interesting phenomenon is playing out in the other smaller category of legal professionals, which is corporate law firms. There you see that the representation is almost equal between male and female across all levels. At entry level, when you enter as an associate, you see equal number of female lawyers entering these corporate law firms, and as one rises up the ladder, you again see more or less equal representation. At least I haven't seen any law firm being depicted in bad light because of not being women friendly. In fact, most of the senior partners in big corporate law firms are female lawyers. And this phenomenon was studied recently by this author called Shweta Balakrishnan. She has published a book on I think it's called Accidental Feminism. We were recently discussing this book. Like, while this is a cause for celebration, right? Like, at least in corporate law firms where big money is involved, you see female lawyers across all levels. But she identifies this as being accidental. It is not really that support structures were created as a matter of policy to ensure that female lawyers stick on. I think it is more of, you know, female lawyers not really having much choice, and they choose the best amongst the worst options that they have. So that is why we see the kind of differences we do with litigation practice and corporate law firm practice. You're on mute, Alok.
As again, thanks, Deepika. This is going to be a theme. Thanks, Deepika. And I think you've raised a very important point here. And I'd like maybe Shrayana first and then Anisha also to weigh in on this. If we sort of look through the gamut of governmental policies, programs related to women, you can see that there is an impetus when it comes to women's health. There is impetus when it comes to women's education. and that sort of finds its way in various different things. There is almost nothing, or I am struggling to think of a particular government policy which says we have to increase women's employment. It's sort of almost seen as a, it'll happen when it'll happen, or if it doesn't, oops, too bad, right? I mean, and at least for me, as somebody who sort of tends to work closely with the government, and as Shrayana puts it very poetically in her book, policy care bears, as we are, it seems to me that, while we will have conversations with people in government about we should do something about women's health, we should do something about women's education, this is a problem which has been, I think, known for a while, right? Even from the chart that you sort of show, it's not as if it was really high and suddenly it's fallen off in the last 5 years. It's been low for a while. And maybe Shrayana and Anisha, if you could just sort of come in a little bit on to why does it seem that across governments, and not just a central state union government, even within state governments, when we sort of speak to them and talk to them, somehow, improving women's participation in the labor force just doesn't seem like a priority, or in current terms, Modi ji hasn't come up with a slogan about it. Why is that?
So Alok, a couple of things. One, there is actually a lot of lip service around this, but it's lip service. There is, for example, there's Mission Shakti. I work, my other hat, I work for the World Bank. Right. There's a project, in fact, that we have with the state government of West Bengal, which is completely focused on women's employment. And in fact, on this, we will hopefully be partnering with Ashoka University soon. And, I do see in my general, interactions with government, with civil society, with even the private sector, I sense that there's concern. There are actually some well-intentioned ideas, but it isn't the number one political priority. I mean, and there is a slogan. The slogan is very much linked to, Beti Padhao and Beti Bachao and all of that stuff, right? Yeah. Now, I want to actually take you back. The answer to this, so I have 2 points to make on this. The answer to this actually even lies all the way back in, debates on the constitutional norms that were between, for example, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and Nehru. Okay, and I mentioned one exchange in the book, which is they're fighting about, he's saying that women need protection and she's saying women need attention. And I think that is actually where we are still stuck. If you look at, so currently the government does publish something called a gender budget, and credit to the national government for doing so. Many states also do the same. Unfortunately, it's around 0.69% of GDP and less than 5% of total expenditure. And the gender budget is usually programs that would be tagged as at least 30% of the beneficiaries are women, and in some cases 100% beneficiaries are women. So the spending is low, but there's a lot of talk. There are scheme line items, there's skill programs, there are programs to try and improve peer-to-peer networks. There are examples, there are self-help group movements, there are examples across the board, but there isn't a holistic policy. You're right. And I just don't think that's because currently the political will to push that through, I do think, is lacking. I would actually argue that the political will on jobs in general is a big question mark right now, given where the economy is, but that's a separate conversation. But I think if I were to take this historically, I would say that if you look at the history of these engagements, and we should remember that feminists have fought very strongly for these. There were a series of government committees that were set up, which came up with some very useful ideas. The reforms on the Maternity Benefits Act, many of the reforms in labor codes to recognize different workers do come from there. So it's not like there hasn't been any movement. It's been really slow, painfully slow perhaps, and they've had to be grabbed. And my sense is that a lot of the spending, while it's low, tends to be on this sort of protection. So we must protect, we must keep and broader investments. I think I'm seeing some interesting things happen now. Transport vouchers, talks increasingly now about tax incentives to firms to try and hire women, tax rebates, providing capital funds for women who are entrepreneurs, for example, right? And each one obviously has its own pitfalls, but at least there is some traction. So I do think, what I do want to signal to you is that I think there is a lot that has been tried. I think what's missing is a holistic policy framework. And is this a political priority? My sense is currently not, because we do have people from different political dispensations who would rather have, I think, women conform to a certain script of womanhood, which is be at home and, caring and caregiving. That's one. I think the second point I just want to make on this, and I think this very much links to what Deepika was saying, and I'm sad Deepika is not a Shah Rukh fan, otherwise I would have added her into my book. Is she a Shah Rukh fan, or she is a Shah Rukh fan? Okay, then maybe in part 2 she can be because she spoke. I mean, I think I was really moved actually just hearing her own experiences, which is, I do think, and here perhaps it's a politically, given the reservation even in our political constituencies has been so deeply problematic. But I do think that it's high time we start to think about actually blocking kinds of jobs and sectors for women. Because my sense is we are in such a bleak place, then nothing short of some very radical measures is really going to start to upset equilibriums, because the current equilibrium is too comfortable. Both from the demand side, the supply side, what Deepika was talking about, the boys clubs. I mean, every institution in India feels like a boys club. There are stories in the book where the private sector as well can feel like that, the codes and scripts. And I think sadly, I'm not a big believer in sort of long-term, what will these kinds of reservations lead to? We will see. These are experiments, but you have to try them. And right now, I'm just not seeing that whole scale. I'm hearing a lot of lip service on creches, but yet the creches are not properly built. I hear lip service on a bunch of schemes, but the schemes are sporadic. In some places, they're implemented well. We should acknowledge that. In others, they aren't. But I think wholesale, taking a step back to say, can we do things that really disrupt the current very comfortable equilibrium? I'm not seeing that. And I think that will actually require a complete radical rethink. You may actually have to say, well, maybe certain public sector jobs are only for women, just as an example. That would force then families to start to update. And there are RCTs that show when families see jobs are targeted for women, suddenly behaviors towards women, their ability to start to access jobs does start to change. So I do think that here we focused a lot, from that perspective of protection, we focused a lot on like maintaining women's place in some way in their home. And of course, these the supply side factors are important, that households are not willing to supply women's labor. So we try and make it easier for them within the home, try and encourage households. But I think the demand side interventions, which is actually disrupting sectors that would hire women through tax rebates, incentives, thinking about how sectors that would typically hire women or are not hiring women can be pushed to do so, and how you disrupt these boys clubs codes. I think economic policy can do a lot on that, but we're just not seeing that because they're much more interested in protecting women than actually attending to them. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thanks, Shrayana. And Anisha, if I can just have you come on that point, but just one additional point that maybe if you could sort of talk about a little bit, it is that, and this is a point that Shrayana also makes in her book, which is that it's not as if we are saying that women don't do any work. Women are in fact busy all day, from pretty much from the moment they wake till they sleep. They barely find any time for themselves. It is that they find it's just that they're not able to do this in a context for pay. They're not able to offer their services or their labor elsewhere outside for pay, and in some senses gain a level of financial independence. Given that, where do you sort of see that government intervention going? Is it about sort of saying that we should find a way to create a demand for this labor, or as perhaps it's an idea which has sort of started being discussed, should the government be like paying women, like say, and this idea has been floated in election manifestos actually, to say that women who are women who are doing household work should be paid a fixed stipend by the government because this is valuable work. We are putting a value it and we are recognizing on it. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about what could be the potential government interventions here.
Yeah, thanks, Alok. I mean, I think something kind of morally quite nice about the idea, right, of paying women for work that they've always done, but that's never been valued. Unfortunately, I think just the transfer of money to compensate for that doesn't necessarily make the work itself more valuable. We live in an economy where certain jobs are considered valuable. And I think there is value, therefore, in ensuring that more and more women get to access those spaces and get to take up that work. And in terms of what's going to actually create those jobs, I mean, I think Shrayana made some really great points about specific interventions to increase female representation in sectors. But at a more macro level, if you're a policy maker and you're staring at the single biggest policy crisis, I would say, facing India right now, it's the ticking time bomb of youth unemployment, which is just going to go off in 10 or 15 years. Right? We're not creating jobs for anybody. And so the idea of saying, well, now I'm going to invest all my time and energy in creating jobs for women or in dividing up available jobs for women, well, that's not going to pay off very much if you're a policymaker. And at some level, we have to address the harder and more difficult question of creating the kinds of jobs that will lead to not just more jobs in general, but better jobs and jobs that are going to get women out of the workplace. So if you look at these kinds of transformations that have taken place in other countries, forget about East Asia, even if you look at Bangladesh, another country, South Asian, similar cultural, social norms, why is their labor force participation so much higher than ours? They were able to take advantage of an opportunity given to them in the form of garments manufacturing. Large scale formal jobs in big factories, managed to recruit a lot of women into jobs there in ways that are very different from how that same process of modernization and industrialization has happened in India. Shrayana talked about this before. Where have most new jobs been created in India in the last 20 years? They've been in micro enterprises. They've not been in large factories. They've not been in large firms. They've really been in small household enterprises that completely replicate the dynamics of the household, of caste networks, of jati networks, of all of the existing kind of pre-modern patterns that we've had in India so far. And so the new jobs that have been created haven't really been transformational in the way that they have been in these other countries, which get women out of the household, migrating, earning more money, living on their own. Those jobs have just simply not been available. And so I think a real priority is going to be creating those kinds of jobs. Yes, we have a bunch of social norms that imprison women in the household. But if there are enough jobs out there that are able to convince people that, look, this is an economic proposition we can't turn away, then the jobs will follow. And I think after that, this whole problem of domestic work and paying for it will also follow. Right? We already, in India, a large number of households across the income distribution already pay other people to do different forms of domestic work. So it's not that that work cannot be monetized. It's just that it doesn't make sense to do it because, of course, the woman's there to do it anyway. What's the point of paying somebody else to do it? It's not like she has something better to do. And I think in the absence of creating those jobs at scale and jobs that are productive, we're going to be left really scrapping among a small number of jobs and trying to reallocate them across an increasingly large pool of both men and women, which is going to be tougher and tougher to do going forward.
Yeah. And I think that's something to kind of keep in mind. And in terms of like those jobs themselves, we've seen recent measures. Maybe they haven't been sort of spoken about specifically as we are trying to get more women into the workplace, but they've sort of been spoken about. At least we are trying to make the workplace more friendly for women. And Deepika, this is probably where I'd sort of wanted to jump in on this. What has been the success of things like the Maternity Benefits Act? Shrayana, you mentioned creches, and Shrayana, we just discussed government intervention. I was reading this article some time ago, which sort of talked about how initially the focus of even the original Maternity Benefits Act in the Bombay legislature was to ensure that women have healthy babies. It wasn't even about how to ensure that they stay in the workforce. It was like, we need to make sure they have healthy babies, so we have to give them maternity leave. Now, of course, at least the rhetoric around the legislation has changed to say that we have to now make workplaces more friendly for women. How kind of successful have they been? What have they sort of resulted in? And where is that gap in state capacity which sort of ensures that a legislation like this can have impact?
So when we're talking about this large scale targeted intervention, Maternity Benefits Act is perhaps right up there. It fits the bill of such an intervention. But again, unfortunately, it is a lip service. If you recall, at least that is the first memory I have of this legislation where Modi ji from, I think during the Republic Day speech, he announced that, there is going to be now maternity benefits legislation. These amendments are going to give, 26 weeks of paid leave, which is the highest in the world. All good on paper. But when it comes to implementation, as Anisha and Shrayana would know as economists, it is abysmal. In fact, it has worked to the detriment of women in the initial few years that these amendments have been in force. And that is because I think the state has displayed complete lack of commitment. And there is actually there's no will to implement this or carry through on those words. It is just meant to be on paper so that it appeases a certain section of society for a limited period of time. Because when it comes to implementation of these changes, which are radical in a way, you need a lot of money. Typically, how maternity benefits legislations have worked in other countries is when the government has chipped in with funds and has dedicated a substantial amount of budget towards ensuring implementation of the paid leave requirement, of creche requirements, of the requirements to enable breastfeeding while the woman is working. However, here in India, this is a peculiar case, and I think this is the only jurisdiction in the world which has gone with this model where the entire burden is on the private sector. So obviously, the private sector is not going to be willingly complying with the requirements of the Act unless there is very high reprimand or some form of punishment for not following these provisions. So neither is there an incentive for sure, nor is there any reprimand for not following these provisions. Hence, the law is as good as a dead letter. Nonetheless, even with I think Maternity Benefits Act, as we all know, it applies to a very small percentage of working women population. Shrayana mentions in her book that a large section of women are employed in informal sector, and Maternity Benefits Act applies only to establishments. So in any case, a lot of women are left out of the application of the Act itself. And even where it applies, obviously, it hasn't fulfilled its objectives. And in fact, there are quite a few studies which show that because of these amendments and because the burden has been entirely put on the private sector, there is a dip in employment of women, especially in the age period where they are likely to get married, where they are likely to go the family way. People just let go of them. And if it is not that the Act does not provide for remedies in such a scenario, you can go to the labor commissioner, you can go to the labor court. But we know how the judicial system is structured, the kind of cost that is involved in fighting out your case, the time and money costs that are involved. It simply does not make practical sense for a woman to pick up that battle. So she just moves on to another job or drops out of labor force entirely. So that is how our legislation is currently formulated, apparently to benefit women. So I actually agree with Anisha when she says that this large scale targeted schemes perhaps don't really work well in the short term or the long term. Something more specific, curated for different categories of professions, different categories of labor forces is perhaps a better way to go, because the kind of structural difficulties that exist are so varied. Just taking from one of the studies that we did on district courts infrastructure, right? The starkest thing that we figured was that 100 district courts in the country don't even have separate washrooms for women. There are no toilets for women. So if that is the case, how will 50% reservation for women encourage more female participation? Even now, like a recent statement by the CJI of the country was that we should give 50% reservation for judges. But how will you pick, say, if it is 32, how will you pick 16 female judges to occupy those positions when you don't have senior members of the bar being female? So there are these structural issues which need to be addressed at each level. You cannot have like a top-down approach for gender disparity, it simply won't work. And again, speaking from personal experience, right? One of the structural issues that I faced as a young mother when I started working with Vidhi, and Alok will know this, it was more to do with the way the building was structured, right? We work out of a co-working space. And here, I don't think I should be hesitating taking names. We work out of WeWork, right? A multi-billion-dollar company. And you would expect that they would have the best of architects, the best of designers, inclusive design experts to be doing their designing. But as a young mother, I did not have I did not have access to a lactation room. And if you have visited any of the WeWork spaces, you will know that it is entirely glass. You know, all the rooms are made of glass. So I was advised to use a restroom as a pumping room. I was like, no, I'm not going to like imagine having a kitchen in the bathroom. That is not going to work, right? So I was given a yoga room which had no lock. So I had to block yoga room calendar for this purpose on a daily basis. But thankfully now the new WeWork locations have lactation rooms. And I think my incessant bombarding with all these breastfeeding articles played a role somewhere. But these are the structural issues that do need, like, you know, long-term thinking and planning, but targeted interventions at a small scale.
Thanks, Deepika. And I think that sort of also leads into one final round of questions that I have. Before I sort of begin on that, just for our audience, if you have questions, we will take them in about 15 minutes or so. A couple of them have come in. So if you could please put in your questions in the question box, Q&A box that you see in your Zoom interface. I will ask them when we have a little bit of time left, once we finish this final round of questions. Shrayana, I just sort of want to start off with you once again. And this has something to do with like the story of Manju that we will talk about. And the aspect of her story that I found most fascinating was the contrast that you drew between Manju and her daughter. Her daughter, who's I think now in her teens, if I'm not mistaken, has a very different worldview from her mother in the context of the fact that she is educated. In fact, to the point that she possibly commits an act of blasphemy in saying that I don't care so much about Shah Rukh. My icons are, you know, Priyanka Chopra and others on who she sees on Instagram, which tells me that there's this, maybe it's an underexplored phenomenon, but perhaps there is a seismic shift that we haven't yet observed. And I just sort of wonder if this is something that we will see in the coming years, that we have put so much pressure, or not pressure, I'd say, they've put so much effort on educating women. Yeah. And the assumption seems to be that you educate women, they'll make for good mothers and wives and they can lead their lives. But there is something which has changed in the way Manju's daughter sees the world. So perhaps if you could just talk a little bit about why that's so important and perhaps what that could lead to going forward.
Alok, I want to start with just one point, which I think leads to the question you have. And I think the mother-daughter group you're talking about is Sandhya and her daughter.
Sorry, Sandhya, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah. No, but I figured. But let me start with this. We should be very careful that at the end of the day, post-liberalization, we had a huge boom in our economy. There was a boom in jobs. There was a boom in construction, retail, transport. Even in our sort of social income milieu, there were more academic jobs to be had, more think tanks to be set up, more magazines. There were all kinds of opportunities. And even in that phase where there was growing employment, only about less than 19% of jobs in the top 10 fastest growing sectors accrue to women. And what I mean to say by this, and this is why I will keep reiterating my somewhat good old, perhaps traditionalist stand, that I do think we need very strong sector level affirmative action for women, because even with the best employment policies, even with the best growth landscape, Deepika will still not have access to her lactation room unless she shows up to work and she constantly sends emails to people saying there needs to be a room. And I think unless we have to be very conscious of the fact that we've actually been through, between liberalization into 2008, 2009, we went through a big growth spurt. That growth spurt has largely accrued to men in terms of jobs. And, you know, I think Kannan and Dr. Ravindran It's a great set of labor economists who've done papers. They call it's a job loss phase of growth. And in fact, the job loss has been for women. And which is why I think even with the best employment policies, the best ideas and intentions, we will always need very targeted, specific affirmative action, perhaps related interventions for women, because without that, we are again going to be at risk at men. And the second point I do want to make is it's not necessary, and I know this is somewhat controversial, it's the country can grow without women ever working outside the home. And we should be conscious that it depends on what is the end goal, right, of these kinds of policy frameworks, because the country can grow very fast, women can be very productive at home, and we can just have an equilibrium like that. And many people may even be comfortable with that. That's just something for us. And I think it's a political conversation. I think the reason, in fact, I wrote the book the way I did is because to me, politically, I believe that women's access to employment isn't just about economic instrumentalism. It's not just about the economy growing. It's about people growing as just people. You feel meaningful, you feel loved, you feel dignified. Some women do with jobs, and there are others who find meaning in other roles. That's a choice. But right now, women who don't just find meaning in mothering and being married are taxed constantly in India. And I think we should be very careful when we think about economic policies. This is not something that I think technocrats think about. And that is a political choice. And I think we need to keep reaffirming that, which links to, I think, the question you asked me about Sandhya and her daughter. So Sandhya is a young domestic worker through that big growth spurt in India. She has seen many of the jobs go to men. She's still struggling to hold on to a job. To her, Mr. Khan is essentially a benevolent patriarch because she belongs to a generation where she believes men should still take care of you. Her daughter has seen, and there are studies that show there are intergenerational effects, especially when women start to step out of the home in terms of social values and the ambitions of young women and even the way young men behave. Which is that because this young girl has seen her mother work and work so hard and fight men, and she's seen her mother fight with her husband, and there's a whole story there which is in the book for people to read. She essentially believes that it is unfair, where her mother does not believe it's unfair for men to be out and about much more. Her daughter sees it as being fundamentally unfair. Her then icons are no longer a man who will love you and who is successful, but women who love themselves and are successful, women who can actuate their own ambitions, women who will write for lactation centers, right? Like those are her role models. She's not interested in the world of just a benevolent patriarch. And we are seeing that shift happen. I think we are currently, I fully agree with Anisha, it's a ticking time bomb, which is our employment crisis, but it's also a mental health crisis. And I would argue men in this kind of scenario are finding meaning in, our current politics, right? Which is this hateful politics, being angry, this politics of relative deprivation. Women largely are keeping to themselves, and there's a crisis brewing within, which at some point will explode. Because what I see when I go to the slums of Delhi or I go to low-income colonies in Ahmedabad, all the stories that I've seen, I see young women seeing Priyanka Chopra, Deepika Padukone, young successful women, and they're saying, why am I not like that? Why can I not aspire to be that? Whereas her mother would never aspire for that. The mother would aspire for a man who would make it easier for her to stay at home and lead a more calm life, like lead the life of what the scripts of motherhood and marriage are supposed to be. But these young girls are not willing, and I write this in the book, they're literate, they're numerate, and they're ready to go somewhere. And yet right now the economy, public space is not particularly friendly, but these women are fighting, Alok. They are all, and there are stories in the book, they are constantly fighting to access space, to access jobs, to actuate their ambitions. My faith, in fact, when it comes to social change and the politics of social changes rise with that generation. So I agree with you, there's a big shift. These are women who are not willing to just sit still and let men take care of them. They want to take care of themselves. And now the real question is, as you know, with Deepika's example of asking for a lactation center and eventually it shows up, where will that groundswell of politics be, where this can become a strong enough political youthful voice, which then sees some response. In some states it might be happening. And my hope is in that shift, in that intergenerational shift. as frustrating as the current scenario is. Thanks.
Thanks, Shrayana. Just perhaps one quick comment maybe from Anisha and Deepika, since Anisha, your job as a lecturer puts you in touch with many young men and women. Have you sort of seen this particular shift? I I won't say shift, but how do you see them framing their prospects, their place in the economy in the future? Is it that a degree is just a nice thing to get before I go get married to someone nice, or, and I'm sure this is probably the more majority opinion, a degree is an opportunity for me to go do something, but what is that something? How do the young women whom we teach sort of, how do they frame it and think about these issues?
Yeah, that's a really nice question, Alok. We just published a paper which looks at major choice by students from elite universities in India. What do they choose to study? It turns out that's still quite gendered. They're not studying economics and science because those are just dominated by men. They prefer to study the humanities and the social sciences. But as an incidental question that we put to these students, we asked them, do you see yourself working 10 years from now? Do you see yourself married 10 years from now? These are 20-year-olds. Do you see yourself having children 10 years from now? And there was no difference between male and female answers on this front. No difference at all, right? This is an elite space, of course. But what's heartening is that studies from non-elite spaces kind of echo the same message. A really nice study from public schools in Haryana found that when you survey 13 to 15-year-old girls and boys about future aspirations, the aspirations of the girls in no way lag the aspirations of the boys, right? So if you ask them, do you want to work? Do you want to just be married and stay at home? You know, everyone wants to work. Everyone wants to go in for higher education. Everyone wants to work. Now, we know that a lot of those girls are not going to land up doing this. And that's really sad. And that should make us all sad and heed the call to action that Shrayana has made. But also on the positive side, I think this does mean that there is a big change underway. I mean, just looking at this from a long view, we have already come a substantial way from gendered norms 50 years ago. And even in countries, you wouldn't think it now, but South Korea in the early 90s had a sex ratio at birth that was as bad as North India. Okay, 10 years later, that's gone. Female infanticide gone. They're having children at parity. And women are participating in the workforce there much higher rates than we could see in India. Yes, there are situations and norms and structures that differ across these countries, but these kinds of things can change. The challenge, though, is that in South Korea, we saw these change happen after 3 decades of economic growth. We aren't even that far along yet. We don't want to have to wait another 3 decades. And so it would be, really important to think more carefully about these kinds of constraints, these kinds of barriers now, so as to hasten along this process a little more.
Thanks, Anisha. And Deepika, perhaps in the specific context of the legal profession, you entered the bar in 2012. Now it's 2022. And as it happens, our office is right next door to the Mayo Hall Court in Bangalore. And you've, of course, visited it often enough. What do you see as the changes, in terms of the composition of the bar and the bench, in terms of at least the younger people entering the profession? How do you think, it's changed for them? What has changed for them?
I will follow on from what Anisha was saying, right? In terms of aspirations, I think plenty has changed. We see a lot of women entering law schools at almost the same level as younger male population. There is equal representation in the student community and at the entry level within the professions. The bigger challenge now for the system is to enable women to continue to be part of this profession. That is where some very strong will has to come from the top within the judiciary, within the bar, at state levels, at district levels. Unfortunately, however, all of those cliques are male dominated. So I don't know from where those intentions will arise. The decision-making bodies are all almost entirely male. So I don't really know where that need for change will trigger. So I really don't know what time it will take to change the existing status quo. But yes, the foundation, I think, is definitely changing, and at least in terms of feelers we get, right? And in terms of the energy that we come face to face with while interacting with our interns or while interacting with law school students. So there, we definitely feel that they are not going to give up easily, but they have to chip away at it slowly. As Shrayana also says in her book, like, it is chipping away slowly at these structures, generation after generation, and that definitely needs to happen at the bar and on the bench. We are still a long way away, though.
Yeah. Thanks, Deepika. Thanks, Shrayana and Anisha also. We have a few questions. I will go through them. I'll try to direct it so that it's easier for you to answer in each. Nivedita asked the question, can the lack of jobs at the macro level, like large factories, be attributed to the convoluted labor laws in India? Perhaps, Shrayana, you can take that first.
So lots of people have tried to prove it and then they can't, because econometrically turns out it's really difficult to do. And I know a lot of people would like to blame labor laws for our lack of entrepreneurial. Okay, so here's what we do know, two things. What we do know is job opportunities in India are highly clustered, and of course having extremely, so remember they've reformed the labor laws, and they've reformed them where now apparently they've been streamlined and simplified. And I'm sure Alok, you and Deepika can say more on whether the streamlining is actually credible. What I've read is it's sort of a mixed bag, but does it make it easier for enterprises to be set up? My understanding is no, because the setup costs and the transaction costs of going through the process remain largely similar. So I don't know whether the labor laws or the reforms around that have helped. The second thing we do know about the labor laws, which make it very difficult, is people keep talking about the hiring and firing of workers, right? And also the fact, but we should also recognize that most workers have informal contracts to start with. I mean, that's majority of our economy. And in fact, there they don't have access to core social insurance or any social security funds, and migrants are completely unprotected. So I would hesitate. I mean, I know that there's a narrative, and of course our labor laws could do with deeper cleaning and perhaps credible reform. I don't know whether the current set of reforms have been credible or not. I mean, they've apparently just been, recoded and consolidated. Maybe others on the panel can say more on that. But I know econometrically, it's been very difficult to prove. It's difficult to say that the job situation is, but there are some labor laws that do hurt women, particularly being able to work outside late at night and so on. And there are constant then changes when it comes to that. So there, but that's not a convoluted. I think the way she asked the question was about convoluted labor laws.
Right.
I don't think that's about that. Let me stop there.
Yeah. And just to add, Shrayana, I think the new labor laws haven't come into force yet. They haven't yet been, so we don't know. But also from my reading of it, it's a huge missed opportunity because the streamlining is not enough. I think there was a chance to update the labor laws given the changed economy that we are living in, which is much more heavily services dominated, and even accounting for the kinds of manufacture that we want to attract into India. That hasn't taken that into account. And if I can just give one example before I move to the next question, those of us who have lived in Karnataka saw last year an outbreak of violence at a semiconductor factory. Those of you who are following the news will have seen that in Tamil Nadu, you had women workers who have gone on protest and strikes in the Foxconn factory, all against existing labor, against poor labor conditions. And this is reflective of the fact that it's not just about whether you can comply with the laws or not, but you think that the labor laws are practically irrelevant to what you're doing. And this creates that resentment in workers, which leads to these outbreaks of violence among workers and dissatisfaction generally. So I wouldn't draw that link either, because I personally don't think even the new changes in the labor laws are in any way streamlined and so on. There's an interesting question from Aruna, and I think I'll ask Anisha to answer this. In terms of support that a working woman has, is it necessary, is it important, or is it kind of irrelevant that she gets support from, especially if whether she's married or not married, if she gets support from her mother or mother-in-law? Is that something, and when I say support, I suppose it could be one of two things. One could be that there is another woman at the home who does the care duties, or another woman who stands up for her psychologically and so on? Are there studies which sort of look at, say, the importance of having someone support your ambitions and aspirations as a working woman? Is there any data on that? Is there any studies on that?
So the way I read this question is, I think Aruna is asking, are working girls more likely to be supported by their mothers or their mothers-in-law? And I mean, the question in a sense is kind of moot. If you're not married, you're living at home with your parents, in which case the decision to work is very much a joint decision made by your entire household, and your parents' views are extremely important. And if you are married, well, then you're living with your in-laws in a country with such strong co-residence norms as we have in India. And in that case, again, it's a joint decision to be made in terms of whether you can work. And that joint decision, the views of the mother-in-law or father-in-law become really important again. All these decisions are jointly taken. And because we have this kind of joint household structure here, yes, that support is imperative. The permission is imperative in order to be able to work. It's not just as easy as saying, well, I just got a job, so see you later, I'm off now, and then you go out and work. There is a lot of research on the impact of living with a mother-in-law on a number of metrics. Most of them relate to, for example, how, what kinds of technologies or medical, technologies you have access to, how you raise your child. And most of the news is bad, right? They tend to, the influence of the mother-in-law is so strong that you end up doing things that belong to a previous generation. So you don't do things that are modern and new. Another very interesting paper recently finds that the influence of the mother-in-law constrains your social network, or the size of your social network and the number of friends you have outside the household. And the number of friends you have is just really strongly correlated with any number of empowerment indicators, including whether you work, the kind of business you're able to run, whether you're financially independent, whether you can even go to a market on by yourself, or find out about contraceptives by yourself. So yeah, the influence is strong, and it, for the most part, it tends to not be a very positive.
Cool. Thanks, Anisha. There's one question from Gautam Pradhan, which I'll sort of direct to Shrayana. Gautam asks that, at least from his reading of the book, it seems that the lack of women in the workforce is more of a social rather than an economic policy or regulation problem. And in this context, and I think this is a valid question that we face ourselves, we assume the answer, but I think it's always good to sort of think it through a little bit. Should solutions be expected from government and policy makers, or is this something which actually talks for social reform led by society? Because I think this is one thing that we've forgotten, how important social reform movements have been in shaping this country. We sort of just read about them. We never look at their direct impact. So I think I just sort of thought I'd put that in.
Alok, thank you, Gautam. That's so critical. And I think if there's a message I have, as I said, I started by saying I have no solutions to offer in the book. That's not my job in the book. But if there is an absolute truth that I do believe in, that's emerging from the book, is that social change is intimate and it's incremental. And what that means is that all of this is actually going to happen through all of us. And the book is in fact just an effort to sort of push that conversation, which is a public conversation. And I'll give you an example of that. And there's so much, I think, written about this, which is there may be multiple schemes and opportunities for women, but if women are not supported by their loved ones to take them up, and I think Anisha just was mentioning how having a mother-in-law, just as an example, just curtails your network of social movement, right? Like your degrees of freedom, then how in the world are you going to go and access all these opportunities? So we could have the best employment policies, the best innovations, the best initiatives, right from labor unions who need to make sure that women's families support their decisions to join the union, right? Right from jobs that women will feel uncomfortable if they're doing things if their loved ones don't support them. And so the one message that at least I want all the readers and people to just walk away from the book is that, of course, government action is important. And I absolutely believe, and which is why I will keep saying that creating the jobs, making sure that those jobs are targeted in a way and subsidized for women, that pathway from entry level to higher level, it will need government intervention and initiative. But just having government interventions and initiatives is going to be completely inadequate, because if communities and families don't support women to actually take that up and make them feel secured, loved, and confident in pursuing their professional ambitions, it's just going to create, again, that mental health crisis I talked about, problems when it comes to self-confidence, and constantly feeling shortchanged and extremely anxious for reasons that, you're constantly navigating all these multiple constraints. So I do agree, Alok. I think the solution to this, while the government can help, of course, but I think the real credible match will be when what government is doing needs to also be met by, and I don't think it needs to be a big social movement. What I literally mean is, how much do you pay your domestic worker in your own home? How do you support women in your own family? Or are men doing the housework, right? Like, there are simple, small interpersonal measures in the workplace. What Deepika mentioned, are male colleagues considerate of what the constraints and sort of the lived experiences of female colleagues are? Are you mentoring enough women, for example? These are all very small interpersonal acts, but I would argue that these small interpersonal acts can then increment and compound to big change, which then will allow for government action to really have credible impact. But without that, we'll have great interventions, which will be sort of piecemeal, but without, and I call them intimate revolutions in the book. I think that's really what we need. And without those, I think this is just going to be a very hard problem to crack.
Thanks. Thanks, Shrayana. We have time for 2 quick questions, and I'll focus on those who haven't had an opportunity to ask question yet. Richa Bansal, who's also with his head of comms, asked this question: given that caste plays a role in the low workforce participation of women in India, do social mores and access play out differently across castes? And I want to add one point to this. And Shrayana, this is something which comes through from your book, which is the Adivasi woman from Jharkhand who comes to Defense Colony to work as a live-in maid. And we've seen that she's not unique or completely alone on this. Does that have something to do with perhaps the fact that traditionally Adivasis have not seen themselves as part of the caste order and have a completely different worldview on this? So if you could just sort of maybe talk about maybe intersect castes and say castes versus caste Hindus versus Adivasis, maybe that might be just one quick point to talk about.
Yeah, look, it is different. Although I think what's happening now is with co-education, the difference is getting very messy. So I can't be very neat about it. In the book, what we do see is, I think, where the most amount of caste oppression plays out. I think the upper caste is sort of has internalized norms so much that I don't think anyone even talks about. Nobody ever talked about, community, but it was just so heavily internalized. I think where this really did play out was, you would have noticed there's a Khatri girl in the book who wants to marry a South Indian man. Actually, she really has fetishized this idea of South Indian men are supposed to be better. They help in the house and all of these things. But she says to me, and I'll never forget it, she said, who let a Khatri girl move to the South, and who let us marry outside our community? And it's a very powerful, and her life is heavily regulated. I mean, her father constantly keeps checking up on what she's doing in the room. There's a lot that's going on, which is very regulated. I think if you compare that to the woman you're talking about, who comes from Jharkhand, is tribal Christian, her, I think, ability to sort of say, well, I want a job is not as contested. Her life is certainly not as regulated. I think the way she talks about just her life in her village. However, when she comes to Delhi, her life is heavily regulated by her employers and the church, right? So if you remember, yes, you're right. So, it operates very differently. But I think what I want to tell everyone is, while yes, of course, the realities and the way a woman's body is policed in sort of, caste honor maintaining societies is very different from those that don't. But I think we live now in a labor market and a social construct where women's bodies will be surveilled. There is a surveillance that will happen. If it's not caste honor, it'll be the honor of the church and the employer who's constantly keeping track of you. And this also, by the way, plays out when contractors take women to SEZs in different parts. I mean, there are enough articles now, and I think Kavita Krishnan has also written about how it's almost like they're playing the role of a benevolent patriarch, right? Like they're almost constantly policing.
Yeah.
So yes, it is different. But even with societies or communities who do not maintain or subscribe to Hindu caste cultures, there are their own technologies of surveillance related to religion, related to their own employers sometimes as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Shrayana. And one last question. I think we'll just take this from Shreya. I'm sorry, there are more questions, I know, but we are really out of time. One last question from Shreya, and I'll just direct it to Deepika. This question has to do with the platform gig economy. And specifically, I think this is being asked in the context of urban company, which was seen as giving opportunities to women. But if you've been following the news in the last few years, women have been at the forefront of pushing back against what they see are exploitative practices of this company. So in the sense, is this just, do we say this company is bad, or do we see that the gig economy doesn't necessarily work in the favor of women? If you could just sort of quickly weigh
just
in
a couple of points, although I don't think I'm an expert on this, but largely gig economy companies are not known for their favorable labor policies. And I think given the ecosystem, it just makes it easier for them to exploit women workforce. From what I understand, they are paid lesser than their male counterparts, and working hours being so erratic. There is no systemic support or no policy internally to even recognize that these are the constraints within which their female workers operate. They are meant to work at par with their male co-workers, but that is simply not how reality is, right? There are so many other constraints, family, childcare, all of that, which women have to equally take care of while also being part of gig economy. So it is almost like that part of a female life is made invisible when it comes to her role as a worker. Which makes it all the more exploitative, right? It is not just about giving her money for the time she spends with your company, but what is it that she's sacrificing, which is always going to be over and above what male workers do, given the kind of society we are in. So I think those are the issues that we need to really understand before we even try to address. That understanding itself is only now, I think, taking shape.
Cool. Thanks, Deepika, and thank you all, Anisha, Deepika, and Shrayana, for what has been a wonderful discussion. I will once again urge everyone to please get yourselves a copy of Shrayana's book, Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh Khan. It is a must read for both who are Shah Rukh Khan fans and also for those of you who really want to understand something that has been going on in the last 30 years. A quick note of thanks to Preeti and Udya, our sign language interpreters, who have been with us patiently over the course of this discussion. And thank you to Maitri, who has been keeping track of our Zoom discussion at the back end. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you took away a lot of very valuable insights from this discussion. And we hope to see you at our next book, Adda. Till then, stay safe, take care. Thank you all and have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alok.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.